Today I'm going to be designing an open top finger jointed box where the fingers of that box will automatically size themselves based on the dimensions of the box and the number of fingers that I want along any given edge. So the first thing that I'm going to do is define some parameters, and I will define the length of the box as 150 millimeters, the width of the box as 75 millimeters, and the height of the box as 30 millimeters. Now these dimensions are not critical, they're just arbitrary numbers here for me to make sure that everything is working correctly, but this design is meant to be reusable in other projects, so I don't really care right now what the final dimensions are going to be. Now, in addition to these dimensions, I need to define a thickness, since I'm expecting that all of the panels for this box will be made out of material that's the same thickness, and I am assuming that this thickness will right now be 1/8 of an inch. Since I'm using metric units for my design, I will use 3.175 millimeters as the thickness. Next, I will define some parameters for the number of fingers that I will have along any given edge, and along the length edge I will say 5 fingers. Along the width edge I will say 3 fingers, and along the height edge I will say 2 fingers. Now I also need to define the formulas that will calculate the width of the fingers based on the dimensions, and it's the same formula for each edge, just with different parameters in each one. So I will define each of the formulas: L finger W for the length, W finger W for the width, and H finger W for the height. And that's it for my parameters right now. So I will close this out. And then I need to create my bottom panel. So I will create a sketch on the XY plane. And I will press R on the keyboard, and then from the origin point, draw out a rectangle and define the width and the length. And then I will press E to extrude this panel using the thickness parameter. And our bottom panel is created. I will go into the body and rename that, and the sketch I will rename. So with the bottom panel created, I will now create the fingers that go across this front edge of the panel. Now I'll create a sketch. I will draw it on the front face of that panel. So we'll click on the front face. Now I will go in and draw a rectangle, and I will hover over the bottom edge of the panel to make sure that my rectangle is going to be constrained to that edge. I will then drag the rectangle up, make sure it's constrained to the other edge and the green X is visible. Now whatever you do here, do not enter measurements or units in these inputs here, because that will, for whatever reason, break the constraints. So click on that edge. You'll see the 2 black dots that show that those corners are constrained to their respective edges. And I'll hit escape just to make sure that I'm able to select a constraint. I will press D on the keyboard for dimension constraint. I will select the top of my rectangle. I could do the bottom, but I'll select the top, drag it up, and then enter L finger W as the width of my rectangle. I also want to click on the left edge while I'm in the dimension constraint mode. Click on the left edge of the rectangle, click on the left edge of the bottom panel, and also say L finger W so that the fingers and notches are the same width. Now I could use the rectangular pattern from the sketch menu, and I could select either the rectangle or just the left and right lines here to copy them across this edge. And I could say L fingers for the quantity, and I could do length minus L finger W times 3, since I want this last finger to be 1 finger width inside, and I want to account for the 2 finger widths on this side here. Now I could do this, and I could click OK, and then I could manually extrude these notches and do negative thickness to cut into the panel. And I have my notches. Here's the problem with doing it this way. If I go up and change the number of fingers for whatever reason, I go up and say I want 10 fingers instead of 5. Fusion360 doesn't know that I want those extra fingers cut, or the extra notches cut into the body, even though it drew all of the lines to do that. Now I could manually go down here to the extrude command that I had done previously, edit feature, and then select each one of these to cut the fingers. And that's fine, but again, I want this to be reusable in other projects, and the dimensions may change in those projects, and I don't want to have to remember to do this, and if I accidentally miss one, I could end up with a box that doesn't fit correctly or anything like that. So instead of doing that, I will back out of that sketch. So instead of duplicating this rectangle in the sketch, I'm going to close out of the sketch with the one rectangle that I drew. I'm going to close out of the sketch. I'm going to extrude by pressing E and then negative thickness to cut into the panel. So I've got my notch created. Fusion360 calls these features. So this combination of faces is a feature. I'm going to use the rectangular pattern from the create menu, not the rectangular pattern from the sketch menu. And I will select this extrusion that I just created, this feature that I just created. I will select the direction and make sure that the arrow is in the correct orientation here along this edge. The distance type is extent, that's correct. The quantity is L fingers, and the distance is, because the arrow is pointing the wrong way, I want the arrow to be pointing this way. I'm going to need to use a negative number here, so I will do negative length minus L finger W, the width of the finger, times 3. And now we have our fingers. So we've got 5 notches, correction, 5 notches, which is what we've defined. Now with those notches created, I'll go in here and I will rename this sketch so that I keep things organized. And now we can create the front panel that will overlap with these fingers and notches here. So I will go up and create another sketch, this time on the XZ plane. And I will use the 3-point rectangle. I will click on the origin point again, which is the lower left edge of the panel. I will click on the lower right edge of the panel, and then I will drag up and set height as the height of my rectangle. I'll then press E on the keyboard, extrude out the panel. The arrow is going in the correct direction, so I will type thickness as my distance value and the operation I need to change to new body to create that panel. So I will click OK. Now I've got my front panel that overlaps with the bottom. I will rename this body, and I will rename this sketch. Now, if you've seen my previous video, the configuration video that I have for Fusion 360, I've got a custom material defined, so this is all my laser cut MDF custom material. So I will press A on the keyboard to bring up the appearance dialog. I will change apply to faces, and then under the favorites tab here, I already have the Fusion 360 default MDF board material. I will drag and drop to the large faces on both of these panels. And now we can see that there is interference between these two panels because the fingers on this bottom panel overlap with the front panel. And since there are no notches cut in that front panel, we've got interference all the way around there. So to fix that, I will click on the Combine tool under the Modify menu. I will select the front panel as my target and the bottom panel as my tool. Make sure that the operation is set to cut and that Keep Tools is enabled. Otherwise, the bottom panel will disappear when I execute this operation. So we'll click on OK. And now we can clearly see that the interference has gone away and the fingers are now cut in my front panel. Now with the fingers along the front edge of my box, I need to add fingers to the left edge of this front panel. So again, I will create a sketch, this time on the left face of that front panel. And once again, I will draw a rectangle. I will constrain it to that edge. I will make sure it's constrained to the other edge, and I will click again. I'll hit escape to make sure I'm in the right mode here. And then I will press D to add a dimension constraint to the finger width. And I'm using H finger W as my width here. And then one more dimension constraint from the bottom of that rectangle to the bottom of the panel, again with H finger width. And I can close that sketch out. Again, I'll extrude a cut into this panel with negative thickness. And then I will use the rectangular pattern from the Create menu, select that last feature that I just extruded, change the direction to make sure it's going in the right direction. The distance type is extent, that's correct. The quantity is H fingers, and the distance is height minus H finger W times 3. Click on OK, and I've got the notches on that panel on the left-hand side. I will rename that sketch. And then I need to copy this panel to the back. So I will hover over it so we can see the profile of the sketch. I'll press E because I can use that face as my reference profile and change the start point from profile plane to from object. And now I can specify where I want my new extrusion to start from, and I want it to start from this back face of the bottom panel, and the arrow points out from the bottom panel, but I want to have this back panel overlap with the bottom of the box. So I will enter minus thickness, and I want to make sure that I have a separate body here, so I will change the operation from join to new body. because I need separate bodies for me to be able to set up the job on the laser cutter. I will click on OK. And now I've got that back panel. The back panel has the same profile shape as the front panel. However, the bottom panel does not have any notches in it. So to fix that, I will go up to the combine menu again. I will select the bottom panel as my target and the back panel as my tool. And we can see that the fingers from the back panel will cut the notches into the bottom panel. Again, making sure operation is cut and keep tools is enabled. Click on OK. And now we've got our notches in the back of the bottom panel. I will rename this panel, and I will press A to bring up the appearance, change the faces, and I will drag and drop my MDF board material to those faces. And now I can move on to the left panel. So I'll create another sketch, this time on the YZ plane. I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally drawing on one of these faces. So I'm on the YZ plane. Again, I will use a 3-point rectangle. I will click on the bottom edge of the box in the back. We'll click on the front edge of the box, which also happens to be the origin point. And then I will click on the top front edge of the box so that this left panel will resize as the width of this box changes. Now I can close this sketch. Again, press E, select the profile, and then the arrow's going in the correct direction, so I will type thickness, make sure that the operation is set to new body, and click OK. And then I'll press A, bring up the appearance. Again, select the apply to as faces and drag and drop to each of those two faces. And once again, we see interference here. So I will go up to the combine tool. I will select now my left panel as my target, and then the back panel, the bottom panel, and the front panel. And before I do that, I realized that I forgot something here, so I'll cancel out of that. And I will just turn off that left panel. I need to draw the fingers in this bottom panel, so I'm going to create another sketch here, this time on the left face of the bottom panel, and draw a rectangle, make sure it's constrained to both edges, press D, and then set the width of the notch, and then another dimension constraint here to make sure that it is offset from the edge correctly. Stop that sketch, press E to extrude, select the rectangle, and the arrows go in the wrong way, so I will do minus thickness to cut that notch. Use the rectangular pattern again, select that feature, select the direction. The arrow is pointing forward and I want it to go back, which means I will do W fingers as my quantity, but I need to do a negative in the distance. So do negative width minus W finger W times 3, and then hit OK. So now I've got my notches in this bottom panel. So I can turn this panel back on, and now I can go up to the combine menu, select the target as the left panel, select the tool in the back, the bottom, and the front. Now all of my fingers are correct. Again, make sure operation and keep tools are correct. Hit OK, and everything's created there. Let me rename this panel and rename this sketch. And rename this sketch. Now, keep in mind, I always use sketch at the end of my sketch names. And the reason for that is if you ever go into the change parameters dialog, you need to look for model parameters, I find it easier to find the sketches by having sketch in the name. So that's why I do that. Now with the left panel created, it's very easy to create our right panel. I will just press E on the keyboard, extrude again. This time I will select the left panel. You can see the profile for the left panel is highlighted. I will click on that. Again, change the start point from profile plane to from object. I will select the right face of the bottom panel. And the arrow is going the wrong way, so I want to extrude over. Whoops, it would help if I could type. I will do negative thickness and change the operation to new body. I'll apply the appearance by pressing A, change apply to faces, and drag and drop over those two main faces. And again, we see appearance or interference, and the reason for that is that the fingers on my right panel are correct, but there are no notches in the other panels. So I will use the combine tool again. This time select the front as the target and the right as the tool. Operation cut and keep tools enabled. Do the same thing for the bottom. And then do the same thing for the back. Now we've got all of our notches cut. So I will rename this panel. And our box is done. If we resize this box, so if I change this, the width and the length, we can see that the fingers, the number of fingers stays the same, but the size of the fingers changes. If I go up and change the number of fingers, then we will see the size of the fingers change. So the problem with this design, if you want your fingers to be consistent in width, this design is not going to work for you because of the fact that the finger widths are actually defined by the dimensions and the number of fingers. So in the next video, I will show you the design that I typically use, which ensures consistent width of all of your fingers, and I find that slightly more aesthetically appealing. I hope this video was useful for you. Please leave feedback or criticism